Margaret had everything: wealth, power, a life most people could only dream of. But in the grand halls of her mansion, all that luxury felt cold and empty. Until one fateful day, he walked into her life. Young, charming, and everything she never expected. Their connection? Impossible. But it was real, and it began to unravel her carefully guarded world. As their paths intertwine, Margaret faces the biggest challenge of her life. One that money can't solve, and no one could see coming. The deeper she falls, the more dangerous the stakes become. And soon, Margaret realizes that the most valuable thing she owns isn't her fortune, but her heart. What happens next will leave you breathless. You won't believe where this story leads. It's a tale of love, sacrifice, and a shocking twist that will stay with you long after the credits roll. The sprawling mansion on Riverside Drive stood as a testament to wealth and success, its manicured lawns and gleaming windows a stark contrast to the emptiness that permeated its halls. Inside, Margaret Holloway, a 72-year-old widow with a net worth that would make most people's heads spin, sat alone in her study, staring out at the Hudson River with eyes that had long since lost their spark. The tick-tock of an antique grandfather clock echoed through the room, each second a mocking reminder of time's relentless march. Margaret's gaze drifted to a framed photo on her desk, a younger version of herself, radiant in a white dress, arm in arm with her late husband, Richard. The happiness in that frozen moment felt like a cruel joke now, a glimpse into a life that no longer existed. With a heavy sigh, Margaret rose from her leather armchair, her joints creaking in protest. She shuffled across the room, past shelves lined with first editions and priceless artworks that had once brought her joy. Now, they were just things, beautiful, expensive things that couldn't fill the gaping void in her soul. As she made her way down the grand staircase, the click of her sensible heels echoed off the marble floors. The house staff, ever present but nearly invisible, watched her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. They had seen the light fade from her eyes over the years, watched as she retreated further into herself with each passing day. Margaret stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, the crisp autumn air nipping at her cheeks. She pulled her Hermes scarf tighter around her neck, a small act of self-comfort in a world that felt increasingly cold. The streets of the Upper East Side bustled with life, young couples arm in arm, children laughing as they raced to Central Park, businessmen power walking to their next meeting. Margaret felt like a ghost among them, unseen and unfelt. She found herself at her favorite cafe, a quaint little place tucked away from the tourist crowds. As she settled into her usual corner table, Margaret couldn't help but notice the couples around her. A young woman threw her head back in laughter at something her partner said, their fingers intertwined on the table. An elderly couple shared a croissant, still looking at each other with love after all these years. The sight sent a sharp pang through Margaret's chest. She remembered when she and Richard would spend lazy Sunday mornings here, planning their next adventure or simply enjoying each other's company. Now, she sat alone, stirring her tea absently as she tried to remember the last time someone had looked at her with genuine affection. As she left the cafe, Margaret's phone buzzed. It was her financial advisor, reminding her about the meeting to discuss selling one of her properties. She had been thinking about downsizing, convinced that getting rid of some of her material possessions might somehow ease the emotional burden she carried. Deep down, she knew it was a futile effort, but it gave her something to focus on, a task to distract her from the crushing loneliness. Lost in thought, Margaret didn't notice the young man rushing down the sidewalk until it was too late. They collided, sending her stumbling backward. Strong hands steadied her, preventing what could have been a nasty fall. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Are you all right?" The concern in the young man's voice was genuine, his blue eyes wide with worry. Margaret found herself momentarily stunned, not by the near fall, but by the unexpected kindness. I'm fine, thank you," she managed, her voice rusty from disuse. The young man, who couldn't have been more than 30, gave her a warm smile that reached his eyes. "I'm Ethan," he said, extending his hand. "Ethan Reeves. I feel terrible about this. Please, let me buy you a coffee to make up for it." Margaret hesitated, every instinct telling her to politely decline and retreat back to the safety of her solitude. But something in Ethan's earnest expression made her pause. When was the last time someone had shown genuine interest in her, not because of her wealth or status, but simply as a person? "That's very kind of you," Margaret heard herself say, surprising even herself. "But I've just had tea. Perhaps another time." Ethan's face lit up. "I'd like that. Here, let me give you my card. I'm actually a real estate agent. If you ever need any help with property matters, or just want to take me up on that coffee, give me a call." As Margaret took the card, their fingers brushed, and she felt an unexpected jolt. It had been so long since she'd had any physical contact with another person, even something as innocuous as this. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. I might just do that." As Ethan disappeared into the crowd, Margaret stood rooted to the spot, his business card clutched in her hand. For the first time in years, she felt a tiny spark of something. Not quite hope, not yet, but a reminder that perhaps the world wasn't as cold and indifferent as she had come to believe. With trembling fingers, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed her financial advisor. "Hello, James? About that property we were discussing. I think I'd like to handle the sale myself. Yes, I know it's unusual, but I have a feeling about this." As she hung up, Margaret felt an unfamiliar sensation stirring in her chest. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but it was something other than the numbing emptiness that had become her constant companion. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret Holloway felt a flicker of curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. Little did she know, this chance encounter on a busy New York street was about to set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, life, and the power of unexpected connections. As she made her way back to her empty mansion, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her world. The void in her soul, so long a gaping wound, felt just a little less overwhelming. The antique clock in the study chimed 5 times as Margaret settled back into her armchair. She held Ethan's business card up to the fading afternoon light, tracing the embossed letters with her fingertip. A decision was forming in her mind, one that both thrilled and terrified her. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow, she would call him about that property. And maybe, just maybe, about that coffee too. As night fell over the city, casting long shadows across her lonely room, Margaret allowed herself to feel something she hadn't dared to in years. The faintest glimmer of hope. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Margaret's bedroom, casting a warm light on her face as she stirred from her slumber. For the first time in years, she hadn't needed to rely on sleeping pills to make it through the night. The events of the previous day still lingered in her mind, a strange mix of uncertainty and anticipation coursing through her veins. With trembling fingers, Margaret reached for her phone on the nightstand. Ethan's business card lay next to it, a tangible reminder that yesterday hadn't been a dream. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Ethan Reeves speaking. "Hello, Mr. Reeves. This is Margaret Holloway. We met yesterday on 5th Avenue. There was a brief pause before Ethan's voice came back, filled with warmth. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm so glad you called. How are you feeling today?" The genuine concern in his tone caught Margaret off guard. I'm well, thank you. I was wondering if you might be available to discuss the sale of one of my properties. And perhaps that coffee you mentioned." As Margaret hung up the phone, having arranged to meet Ethan later that afternoon, she felt a flutter in her chest, a sensation so foreign that it took her a moment to recognize it as excitement. The hours seemed to crawl by as Margaret prepared for their meeting. She found herself taking extra care with her appearance, something she hadn't done in years. As she applied a touch of lipstick, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. There was a spark in her eyes that had been missing for so long. The coffee shop Ethan had suggested was a quaint little place in the West Village, far from Margaret's usual haunts. As she pushed open the door, the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee beans enveloped her. Ethan stood as she approached, his face lighting up with a smile that seemed to chase away some of the shadows that had long haunted Margaret. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm so glad you could make it," Ethan said, pulling out a chair for her. "Please call me Margaret," she found herself saying, surprising even herself with the informality. As they settled into conversation, ostensibly about the property Margaret wanted to sell, she found herself opening up in ways she hadn't done in years. Ethan listened attentively, his eyes never leaving her face, as if every word she spoke was of utmost importance. "You know," Margaret said, her voice soft with reminiscence, "this house, it was the first place Richard and I bought together. We had such dreams for it." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Tell me about Richard," he said gently. And so Margaret did. She spoke of their whirlwind romance, of building their empire together, of the laughter and tears they had shared. As she talked, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, years of pent-up emotions finding release. "I'm sorry," she said finally, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "I don't know what's come over me. You must think I'm a silly old woman." Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through Margaret's body. "No," he said firmly. "I think you're an incredible woman who's been carrying a heavy burden for far too long." As their conversation continued, Margaret found herself drawn to Ethan's own story. He spoke of growing up in a small town in Ohio, of dreams deferred and the struggle to make it in the big city. There was a vulnerability in his words that resonated deeply with Margaret. "Sometimes," Ethan confessed, his eyes downcast, "I wonder if I made the right choice coming here, if I'm really cut out for all this." Without thinking, Margaret reached out, her hand gently tilting Ethan's chin up so their eyes met. "You are capable of so much more than you know," she said softly, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. As the afternoon wore on, their discussion of property sales long forgotten, Margaret felt something stirring within her, a feeling she had thought long dead. In Ethan's presence, the world seemed a little brighter, the future a little less daunting. When they finally parted ways, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Ethan insisted on walking Margaret to her car, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The gesture, so simple and yet so intimate, sent a shiver down her spine. "Thank you for today," Margaret said as they reached her vehicle. I haven't enjoyed myself like this in a very long time." Ethan's smile was warm, his eyes twinkling in the fading light. "The pleasure was all mine, Margaret. I hope we can do this again soon." As Margaret drove home, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The mansion that had felt like a mausoleum for so long now seemed filled with possibilities. That night, as she lay in bed, Margaret found herself doing something she hadn't done in ages. She was looking forward to tomorrow, and as she drifted off to sleep, a small smile played on her lips, her dreams filled with the warmth of Ethan's eyes and the gentle touch of his hand. Little did Margaret know that this newfound hope, this unexpected connection, would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The light that had begun to shine in her darkness was about to reveal shadows she had long kept hidden, even from herself. The gentle patter of rain against the window roused Margaret from her fitful sleep. She blinked, disoriented, as the familiar ache in her bones made itself known. For a moment, the events of the past few days felt like a distant dream, but the warmth in her chest at the thought of Ethan was undeniably real. As she slowly sat up, a sharp pain shot through her side, a stark reminder of the secret she'd been carrying. Margaret's hand instinctively went to the spot, pressing gently as if she could push the truth away. The diagnosis had come months ago, but she had refused to let it define her, or worse, to let anyone know. Cancer. The word itself felt like a death sentence. With a heavy sigh, Margaret reached for the pill bottle on her nightstand. The medication helped with the pain, but it couldn't touch the deeper ache of loneliness and fear that had taken root in her heart. As she swallowed the pills, her eyes fell on her phone. A text from Ethan glowed on the screen. "Good morning, Margaret. I hope you slept well. I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday." Would you like to meet for lunch? A smile tugged at Margaret's lips, even as a wave of guilt washed over her. She hadn't told Ethan about her condition. How could she? The thought of seeing pity in those kind eyes was unbearable. And yet, the thought of pushing him away felt equally impossible. With trembling fingers, Margaret typed out a reply, agreeing to meet Ethan at a quiet bistro near Central Park. As she hit send, she felt a mix of excitement and dread. How long could she keep her secret? And what would happen when the truth inevitably came out? The hours seemed to crawl by as Margaret prepared for their lunch date. She found herself taking extra care with her appearance, applying makeup to hide the pallor that had become more pronounced in recent weeks. As she fastened a string of pearls around her neck, a gift from Richard on their 25th anniversary, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked fragile, almost ghostly. Margaret straightened her shoulders, determined not to let her illness show. The bistro was warm and inviting, a welcome respite from the dreary weather outside. Ethan was already there, his face lighting up as he saw Margaret approach. He stood, pulling out her chair with a gentlemanly flourish that made Margaret's heart flutter. "You look beautiful," Ethan said softly as she sat down, his eyes warm with admiration. Margaret felt a blush creep up her cheeks, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you, Ethan. You're too kind." As they settled into conversation, Margaret found herself torn between the joy of Ethan's company and the weight of her secret. Every laugh, every shared smile felt bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that their time together was limited in ways Ethan couldn't possibly understand. "Margaret," Ethan said suddenly, his tone serious, "there's something I wanted to talk to you about." Margaret's heart leapt into her throat. Had he somehow guessed her secret? She braced herself, waiting for the worst. I know we haven't known each other long," Ethan continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I feel a connection with you that I can't explain. You've awakened something in me, Margaret, a desire to be better, to do more with my life." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes as Ethan spoke. His words, so heartfelt and genuine, only made her dilemma more painful. How could she let this beautiful soul invest in a relationship that was doomed from the start? "Ethan," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper, "There's something you should know about me." But before she could continue, a sharp pain lanced through her side, causing her to gasp and clutch at the table. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, concern etched across his face. "Margaret, what's wrong? Should I call an ambulance?" Through gritted teeth, Margaret shook her head. No, I'll be fine. Just give me a moment." As the pain subsided, Margaret found herself enveloped in Ethan's arms, his warmth seeping into her tired bones. For a brief, beautiful moment, she allowed herself to lean into his embrace, to pretend that everything was normal, that they had all the time in the world. But reality came crashing back as Ethan helped her to her feet. "Margaret, please," he pleaded. "Let me take you to a doctor. This isn't normal." Margaret steeled herself, knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. With a deep breath, she looked into Ethan's worried eyes and spoke the words she had been dreading. "Ethan, I'm dying." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret watched as understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes, followed quickly by a maelstrom of emotions. Shock, disbelief, and a pain so deep it took her breath away. How long?" Ethan's voice was barely audible, choked with emotion. "The doctors say I have maybe 6 months at best," Margaret replied, her own voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "I didn't want anyone to know. I couldn't bear the thought of being treated differently, of being pitted." Ethan's grip on her hands tightened, his eyes never leaving her face. "Margaret, I don't know what to say, but please don't push me away. Let me be here for you, in whatever way you need." As Margaret looked into Ethan's tear-filled eyes, she felt a dam break within her. All the fear, the loneliness, the pain she had been holding back came rushing out. She collapsed into Ethan's arms, her body racked with sobs. In that moment, as the rain continued to fall outside and the world around them faded away, Margaret realized that she had been given a precious gift. Not just more time, but a chance to truly live again in the time she had left. As Ethan held her, whispering words of comfort and support, Margaret made a silent vow. She would face whatever came next with courage and grace, no longer alone but with this unexpected ally by her side. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges neither of them could foresee. But for the first time since her diagnosis, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. The secret was out, the truth laid bare. And yet, as Margaret looked up into Ethan's eyes, she saw not pity, but a determination that matched her own. Whatever time they had left, they would face it together. As they left the bistro, hand in hand, neither Margaret nor Ethan noticed the curious glances from other patrons. They were too lost in their own world, a world where age and illness faded away, leaving only the pure, unfiltered connection between two souls who had found each other against all odds. The rain had stopped, and a weak sun was peeking through the clouds. As they walked through Central Park, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The future was still uncertain, fraught with challenges she could scarcely imagine. But for now, in this moment, she was alive, and she was no longer alone. The crisp autumn air nipped at Margaret's cheeks as she and Ethan strolled arm in arm through Central Park. The trees, adorned in vibrant shades of red and gold, seemed to mirror the warmth blooming in her heart. It had been 2 weeks since she had revealed her illness to Ethan, and to her amazement, he hadn't wavered in his commitment to stand by her side. As they rounded a bend in the path, a group of joggers passed by, their curious glances lingering a moment too long on the unlikely pair. Margaret felt Ethan's arm tighten protectively around her, and she leaned into his warmth, grateful for his presence. "You know," Ethan said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never thought I'd find myself here, like this, with you." Margaret looked up at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "And I never thought I'd find myself falling for a man young enough to be my grandson. Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Their laughter, a harmonious blend of youth and wisdom, drew more stares from passers-by. But in that moment, neither of them cared about the outside world. They were in their own bubble, where age was just a number and love knew no boundaries. As they settled onto a park bench overlooking the lake, Margaret noticed a young couple a few feet away, whispering and casting furtive glances in their direction. She felt a familiar pang of self-consciousness, but Ethan's gentle squeeze of her hand grounded her. "Don't let them get to you," he murmured, his blue eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. "They don't understand what we have." Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed insistently. It was her daughter, Catherine. With a sigh, Margaret answered the call. "Mom!" Catherine's voice was tight with concern. "Where are you? I've been trying to reach you all morning. Mrs. Perkins said she saw you in the park with a young man. What's going on?" Margaret closed her eyes, steeling herself for the conversation she had been dreading. "Catherine, darling, there's something I need to tell you. Can you meet me for dinner tonight? There's someone I'd like you to meet." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "Of course, Mom. I'll be there at 7. As Margaret hung up, she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. Ethan, sensing her distress, pulled her close, his warmth a comforting balm against the chill of uncertainty. "It'll be okay," he whispered, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "We'll face this together." The hours seemed to fly by, and before Margaret knew it, she was standing in her foyer, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her dress as she waited for Catherine to arrive. Ethan stood beside her, a steady presence in the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The doorbell rang, its chime echoing through the cavernous space. Margaret took a deep breath, squeezing Ethan's hand one last time before opening the door. Catherine stood on the threshold, her eyes widening as they fell on Ethan. The resemblance between mother and daughter was striking, but where Margaret's face was etched with the wisdom of years, Catherine's bore the sharp edges of judgment and confusion. "Mom," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "won't you introduce us?" Dinner was a tense affair, the clinking of silverware against fine china punctuating the stilted conversation. Catherine's gaze flitted between Margaret and Ethan, her brow furrowed in a mix of concern and disapproval. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared away, Catherine set down her napkin with a decisive motion. "All right, Mom, what's really going on here? Is this some kind of midlife crisis?" Margaret felt a flash of indignation, but Ethan's hand on her knee under the table steadied her. She took a deep breath, meeting her daughter's gaze squarely. "Catherine, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you months ago." Margaret's voice wavered slightly as she continued. "I'm ill, sweetheart. The doctors, they don't think I have much time left." The color drained from Catherine's face, her earlier hostility evaporating in an instant. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" As Margaret explained her diagnosis, her fear of being treated differently, of becoming a burden, she felt Ethan's unwavering support beside her. When she finished, the room was silent save for Catherine's muffled sobs. "And Ethan?" Margaret said softly, reaching for his hand. "Ethan has been my light in this darkness. He's given me a reason to embrace every moment I have left." Catherine looked at Ethan, really looked at him for the first time that evening. The genuine care and affection in his eyes as he gazed at Margaret was undeniable. I don't understand it," Catherine said slowly, "but I can see how much you care for each other. Mom, I'm sorry for jumping to conclusions. I want you to be happy." As the evening wound down, the earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by a tentative acceptance. Catherine hugged her mother fiercely before leaving, whispering promises to visit more often, to make the most of their time together. Later, as Margaret and Ethan sat in the quiet of her study, she felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with challenges both physical and emotional. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. "Thank you," she murmured, leaning into Ethan's embrace, "for standing by me, for helping me face my fears." Ethan's arms tightened around her, his voice thick with emotion. "Margaret, you've given me more than you could ever know. Every moment with you is a gift." As they sat there, bathed in the soft glow of the firelight, Margaret realized that she had found something she thought was lost forever, not just love, but a reason to live fully, passionately, in the time she had left. Outside, the city that never sleeps continued its relentless pace. But inside this room, time seemed to stand still, allowing two souls from different worlds to find solace and joy in each other's arms, heedless of the judgments and prejudices that awaited them beyond these walls. The gentle hum of medical equipment filled the sterile hospital room as Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on her gown. The weight of the decision before her pressed heavily on her shoulders, making the air feel thick and oppressive. Dr. Patel, a kind-faced woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, stood nearby, chart in hand. Her voice was gentle but firm as she spoke. "Mrs. Holloway, I know this is a lot to take in, but we need to make a decision about treatment soon. The clinical trial I mentioned could potentially extend your life by several months, maybe even a year. But the side effects..." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. The prospect of more time was tempting, but at what cost? She thought of the grueling chemotherapy sessions she'd endured in the early stages of her diagnosis, how they'd left her weak and hollow. Was she willing to spend her remaining days feeling like a shell of herself? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Ethan poked his head in, his eyes immediately finding Margaret's. "Is it okay if I come in?" Dr. Patel nodded, excusing herself to give them a moment of privacy. As the door closed behind her, Ethan crossed the room in 3 quick strides, enveloping Margaret in a warm embrace. "I'm sorry I'm late," he murmured into her hair. "Traffic was a nightmare." "What did the doctor say?" Margaret took a deep breath, inhaling Ethan's familiar scent, a mix of cologne and something uniquely him. It grounded her, giving her the strength to voice the thoughts swirling in her mind. "There's a new clinical trial," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It could give me more time, but..." "Ethan, I don't know if I can go through that again. The pain, the sickness. I don't want my last memories to be of hospital rooms and 4 drips." Ethan pulled back slightly, his blue eyes searching her face. The love and concern she saw there nearly broke her. "Margaret, whatever you decide, I'm here. We'll face it together." A lump formed in Margaret's throat. How had she gotten so lucky to find this man? This beacon of support and understanding, so late in life. The irony wasn't lost on her, finding true love just as her time was running out. "I think," Margaret said slowly, each word weighted with the gravity of her decision. "I think I want to focus on quality of life, not quantity. I want to spend whatever time I have left really living, Ethan, with you." The moment the words left her lips, Margaret felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was as if a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Ethan's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but his smile was radiant. "Then that's what we'll do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll make every day count." As Dr. Patel returned to discuss palliative care options, Margaret felt a strange mix of sadness and excitement. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in months, she felt truly alive. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Margaret, with Ethan by her side, threw herself into living life to the fullest. They traveled to places she'd always dreamed of seeing: the sun-drenched coast of Amalfi, the misty highlands of Scotland, the bustling streets of Tokyo. In each new place, Margaret felt as though she were shedding layers of her old self, embracing a newfound zest for life. But it wasn't just the grand adventures that brought joy. It was the quiet moments: 2 lazy Sunday mornings spent reading the paper together, impromptu dance sessions in her living room to old jazz records, late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. One crisp autumn evening, as they strolled through Central Park, the trees ablaze with color, Ethan suddenly dropped to one knee. Margaret's heart leapt into her throat as he pulled out a small velvet box. "Margaret," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I know our time together might be short, but these past few months have been the happiest of my life. I want to spend whatever time we have left as your husband. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she nodded, unable to form words. As Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, a beautiful vintage piece that perfectly suited her style, she felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. The news of their engagement spread quickly, eliciting a mix of reactions from friends and family. Some were supportive, seeing the genuine love between them. Others were skeptical, unable to understand how 2 people from such different stages of life could truly connect. Catherine, to Margaret's surprise and relief, had become one of their staunchest supporters. "Mom," she had said during a heart-to-heart, "I've never seen you so happy. How could I not support that?" As the wedding day approached, Margaret found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. The cancer was progressing faster than anticipated, and her energy levels were rapidly declining. The thought of postponing the wedding was heartbreaking, but she worried about not being able to fully enjoy the day. It was Ethan who came up with the solution. "Let's do it now," he suggested one evening as they sat in her garden, watching the sunset. "Just us and a few close friends and family. Something small and intimate." And so, on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, Margaret found herself standing in her backyard, transformed into a magical setting with twinkling lights and flowers everywhere. As she walked towards Ethan, resplendent in a simple cream dress that made her feel like a bride out of a fairy tale, she felt a profound sense of rightness. The ceremony was short but deeply moving. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for whatever time they had left, there wasn't a dry eye in the small gathering. Later that night, as they swayed gently to their first dance as husband and wife, Margaret looked up at Ethan. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a reason to live, truly live at the end." Ethan's arms tightened around her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "No, Margaret, thank you for showing me what real love is, for teaching me that life is precious and should be lived to the fullest, no matter how much time we have." As the music played on and their friends and family looked on with a mix of joy and bittersweet understanding, Margaret closed her eyes and let herself get lost in the moment. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be pain and heartache. But in this moment, in Ethan's arms, she felt invincible. The choice she had made to live fully and love deeply in the face of death had changed everything. And as she looked towards the future, uncertain as it was, Margaret felt not fear, but a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected gift of love she had found at the end of her journey. The soft beeping of medical equipment filled the quiet hospital room as Margaret lay propped up against a mountain of pillows, her once vibrant frame now frail and pale. Ethan sat beside her, his youthful hand gently clasping her weathered one, a stark visual reminder of their unconventional love story. "Ethan, darling," Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't have to stay here all day. Go home. Get some rest." Ethan's blue eyes, filled with a mixture of love and worry, met hers. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be, Margaret. I promise to be with you through everything. Remember." A weak smile played on Margaret's lips as she remembered their wedding day, just 2 short months ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then, the cancer progressing far more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. As if reading her thoughts, Ethan leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "I don't regret a single moment, you know? These past few months with you have been the most meaningful of my life." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. The depth of Ethan's devotion still amazed her, even as it filled her with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. She couldn't help but think of all the things he was sacrificing to be here with her. His youth, his future, the chance for a long life with someone his own age. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Patel entered, her face a mask of professional calm, but Margaret could see the sadness in her eyes. "Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Reeves," she greeted them softly. "I have the latest test results. I'm afraid the cancer has spread more aggressively than we anticipated. We're looking at weeks now rather than months." The words hung heavy in the air. Margaret felt Ethan's hand tighten around hers, heard his sharp intake of breath. She closed her eyes, letting the reality of her situation wash over her. When she opened them again, she was surprised to find not despair, but a sense of calm acceptance. "Thank you, Dr. Patel," she said softly, "for everything you've done." As the doctor left, promising to adjust Margaret's pain management plan, Ethan turned to her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Margaret, She placed a finger gently on his lips. "Show my love. We knew this day was coming. I need you to promise me something." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. "Promise me you'll live, Ethan. Really live. When I'm gone, I don't want you to waste your life mourning me. Travel, fall in love again, have the family we couldn't have. Live the life you deserve." Ethan's composure finally broke, tears streaming down his face. "How can you ask me that? You are my life, Margaret. I can't imagine." Margaret mustered all her strength to cup his face in her hands. "You can and you will. That's how you'll honor what we had. By living fully, just like we did these past months." As Ethan buried his face in her shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs, Margaret stroked his hair, her heart breaking for the pain she knew she was causing him. The next few days passed in a blur of visitors, tearful goodbyes, and quiet moments between Margaret and Ethan. Catherine practically moved into the hospital, determined to spend as much time as possible with her mother. One evening, as Margaret dozed fitfully, she overheard a conversation between Catherine and Ethan in the hallway. "I didn't understand at first," Catherine was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "But seeing you two together, the way you look at her, thank you, Ethan, for loving her, for making her so happy at the end." "She made me happy," Ethan replied softly. "She taught me what it means to really live, to love without reservation. I just wish." "I know," Catherine said. "We all do." As the days wore on, Margaret found herself drifting in and out of consciousness more frequently. But in her lucid moments, she made sure to tell Ethan how much she loved him, how grateful she was for their time together. On what would turn out to be her last night, Margaret woke to find Ethan asleep in the chair beside her bed, his hand still holding hers. In the dim light of the hospital room, she studied his face, the lines of worry that had appeared in recent weeks, the stubble on his chin, the flutter of his eyelashes as he dreamed. With tremendous effort, Margaret reached out to stroke his cheek. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, immediately filling with love as they met hers. "Margaret," he breathed, sitting up straighter. "How are you feeling?" She smiled weakly. "Like it's time, my love." Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes, followed quickly by panic. "No, Margaret, please. Just hold on a little longer. I'm not ready." "Shoo," Margaret soothed, summoning the last of her strength. "You'll never be ready, darling. But it's okay. I'm not afraid. Not anymore." Tears fell freely down Ethan's face as he clutched her hand. "I love you, Margaret, more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you, Ethan," Margaret whispered. "Thank you for giving me a lifetime of love in just a few short months." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the hospital window, Margaret took her last breath, surrounded by the love she had found so unexpectedly at the end of her life. In the days and weeks that followed, Ethan moved through his grief like a man in a fog. The weight of his sacrifice, the future he had given up, the dreams he had set aside, pressed heavily upon him. But in quiet moments, when the pain seemed unbearable, he would remember Margaret's words, "Live fully, just like we did." And slowly, with the support of Catherine and the friends he had made through Margaret, Ethan began to do just that. He threw himself into his work, started volunteering at a local hospice, and eventually, hesitantly, began to open his heart to the possibility of love again. Margaret's influence lived on in every choice Ethan made, in every moment he chose to embrace life fully. And though the weight of his sacrifice was heavy, the love and joy he had experienced made it all worthwhile. As years passed, Ethan would often find himself in Central Park, sitting on the bench where he and Margaret had shared so many precious moments. And in those quiet times, he could almost hear her voice on the breeze, encouraging him to keep living, keep loving, keep embracing every moment of the precious gift that is life. The soft beep of medical equipment filled the quiet hospital room as Margaret lay still, her once vibrant frame now frail and pale against the stark white sheets. Ethan sat beside her, his youthful hand gently clasping her weathered one, a stark visual reminder of their unconventional love story. The past week had been a blur of doctors, nurses, and tearful visits from friends and family as Margaret's condition rapidly deteriorated. Catherine entered the room quietly, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Ethan, her eyes full of concern. "Any change?" she asked softly. Ethan shook his head, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face. "The doctor says it could be any time now," he whispered, his voice hoarse from unshed tears. Catherine placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You should get some rest, Ethan. I can stay with her for a while." But Ethan shook his head firmly. "I promised her I'd be here until the end. I won't leave her now." As if stirred by their voices, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze before recognition set in. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "Catherine." Ethan leaned forward, gently squeezing her hand. "We're here, my love. We're right here with you." Margaret's lips curved into a weak smile. "My 2 favorite people," she murmured. "I'm so lucky." Catherine moved to her mother's other side, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I love you so much. I'm sorry for all the times I dash." Margaret cut her off with a gentle squeeze of her hand. "No apologies, sweetheart. Not now. Just know that I love you, and I'm so proud of the woman you've become." Ethan watched the exchange between mother and daughter, his heart swelling with love and breaking simultaneously. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, strong, compassionate, and full of grace even in her final moments. As the day wore on, Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness. In her lucid moments, she shared memories, whispered words of love, and even managed a few weak laughs at old jokes. Ethan and Catherine hung on her every word, knowing that each one could be her last. Around sunset, Margaret's eyes opened wide, suddenly clear and alert. "Ethan," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "Help me sit up, please." Carefully, Ethan adjusted her pillows, supporting her frail body as he helped her into a sitting position. Margaret's gaze swept the room before settling on Ethan's face. "My darling," she began, her voice filled with emotion. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave an old woman a chance to feel young again, to experience love in its purest form." Ethan felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Margaret, you gave me so much more. You taught me what it means to truly live, to love without reservation." Margaret smiled, reaching up to cup his cheek with a trembling hand. "Promise me something, Ethan. Promise me you'll keep living, keep loving. Don't let my memory hold you back." Ethan nodded, unable to speak through the lump in his throat. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Margaret then turned to Catherine. "My beautiful girl," she whispered, "take care of each other, won't you? And remember, I'll always be with you." Catherine nodded, sobbing quietly as she clutched her mother's hand. As night fell, Margaret's breathing became more labored. Ethan and Catherine moved closer, enveloping her in a gentle embrace. They whispered words of love and comfort as Margaret's breaths grew slower and more shallow. With one last, peaceful smile, Margaret closed her eyes. The room fell silent save for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Ethan felt as if the world had stopped spinning. He clung to Margaret's hand, his body tense with anticipation and fear. Catherine's quiet sobs filled the room as she held onto her mother's other hand. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting medication. But Margaret remained unresponsive, her breathing shallow but persistent. As dawn broke, painting the New York skyline in hues of pink and gold, Ethan and Catherine found themselves in a surreal limbo. Margaret clung to life with a tenacity that both inspired and devastated them. Dr. Patel entered the room, her face a mask of professional calm. She checked Margaret's vitals and reviewed the charts before turning to Ethan and Catherine. "She's holding on," Dr. Patel said softly. "It's not uncommon for patients to rally like this near the end. It's often called the terminal lucidity, or the last rally." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. How much longer?" Dr. Patel shook her head gently. "It's impossible to say. Could be hours, it could be days. The best thing you can do is be here. Let her know you're with her." As the doctor left, Ethan turned to Catherine, their eyes meeting across Margaret's bed. A silent understanding passed between them. They would be here until the very end, whenever that might be. The day passed in a haze of quiet conversations, shared memories, and moments of tense silence. Friends and distant relatives came to pay their respects, their hushed voices and tear-stained faces a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation. As evening approached, Ethan found himself alone with Margaret. Catherine had reluctantly left to shower and change, promising to return quickly. In the quiet of the room, Ethan leaned close to Margaret's ear. "I don't know if you can hear me, my love," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. You showed me what it means to live fully, to embrace every moment. I promise you, I'll carry that lesson with me always." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I know you're tired, Margaret. I know you're fighting so hard, but it's okay to let go. Catherine and I will be okay. We have each other, thanks to you." As if in response, Margaret's fingers twitched slightly in his hand. Ethan's heart leapt, hope and fear warring within him. But Margaret remained still, her breathing unchanged. The night deepened, the city lights twinkling beyond the hospital window. Ethan found himself drifting in and out of a restless sleep, his hand never leaving Margaret's. Catherine returned, taking up her vigil on the other side of the bed. In the early hours of the morning, a change came over Margaret. Her breathing, which had been shallow but steady, began to falter. Ethan and Catherine exchanged a panicked look, both realizing that the moment they had been dreading was upon them. "Mom," Catherine choked out, leaning close. "We're here. We love you so much." Ethan pressed Margaret's hand to his lips. "It's okay, my darling. You can rest now." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the hospital window, Margaret took a deep, shuddering breath. Then, with a soft sigh, she was gone. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. The absence of Margaret's labored breathing, the stillness of her chest, the quiet that followed the silenced heart monitor. It all crashed over Ethan and Catherine in a wave of finality. Ethan felt as if the world had stopped spinning. He clung to Margaret's still form, his body racked with silent sobs. Catherine's cries filled the room as she held onto her mother's other hand. As the morning sun rose over New York City, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Ethan and Catherine sat in stunned silence, the reality of their loss slowly sinking in. Margaret Holloway, a woman who had lived life to its fullest until her very last breath, was gone. In that quiet hospital room, as the city outside began to stir to life, Ethan and Catherine held onto each other, united in their grief and in their love for the remarkable woman who had brought them together. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with pain and longing. But in that moment, they found solace in each other and in the memories of the love they had shared with Margaret. The day stretched ahead, filled with the daunting tasks that follow a loved one's passing. But for now, in the soft light of dawn, Ethan and Catherine allowed themselves to grieve, to remember, and to honor the woman who had changed their lives forever. The weeks following Margaret's passing passed in a blur for Ethan. The funeral arrangements, the steady stream of well-wishers, the legal intricacies of Margaret's estate. It all felt like a surreal dream from which he couldn't wake. He moved through each day in a fog, his grief a constant, dull ache in his chest. The funeral itself was a grand affair, befitting a woman of Margaret's stature. The old church on the Upper East Side was filled to capacity, a sea of black-clad mourners paying their respects. Ethan sat in the front pew beside Catherine, both of them stoic in their shared sorrow. As eulogies were delivered, painting a picture of Margaret's life, her business acumen, her philanthropy, her zest for life, Ethan found himself reflecting on the Margaret he had known, the woman who had taught him to seize every moment, who had shown him the depth and breadth of love. He listened as others spoke of her accomplishments, but all he could think of was her laugh, the twinkle in her eye when she was about to say something mischievous, the softness of her hand in his. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he approached the podium with trepidation. He could feel the curious eyes of the congregation upon him, the young man who had captured Margaret's heart in her final months. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "Margaret Holloway was an extraordinary woman," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Many of you knew her longer than I did, saw her accomplish incredible things. But I had the privilege of knowing Margaret in a different way. I knew her as a woman who embraced life with both hands, who wasn't afraid to take chances, even when time was short." As Ethan continued, his voice grew stronger. He spoke of Margaret's courage, her kindness, her ability to find joy in the smallest moments. He shared anecdotes that brought both laughter and tears to the assembled mourners. And as he spoke, he felt a shift within himself. The fog of grief began to lift, replaced by a deep gratitude for the time he had shared with Margaret. "Margaret taught me that love knows no boundaries," Ethan concluded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Not age, not time, not even death. She showed me what it means to live fully, to love deeply, and to face the unknown with grace and courage. Her life was a gift to all who knew her, and her love will continue to guide and inspire me for the rest of my days." As Ethan returned to his seat, he felt Catherine's hand slip into his. They exchanged a look of understanding, bound together by their love for Margaret and the lessons she had taught them both. In the days that followed, as the initial shock of loss began to fade, Ethan found himself at a crossroads. The life he had envisioned with Margaret was gone, leaving him adrift. He thought often of her final request, that he continue to live and love fully. But the prospect of moving forward without her seemed daunting, almost impossible. It was Catherine who eventually pushed him to take the first step. She invited him to volunteer at the hospice where Margaret had spent her final days. Initially reluctant, Ethan found himself drawn to the work. There was something cathartic about being able to provide comfort to others facing the end of life, to share the wisdom Margaret had imparted to him. As weeks turned to months, Ethan slowly began to rediscover himself. He threw himself into his work, using the lessons Margaret had taught him about seizing opportunities and living without fear. He traveled, crossing off destinations from the list he and Margaret had made together. And though each new experience was tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that she wasn't there to share it, Ethan found joy in honoring her memory through his actions. One crisp autumn day, almost a year after Margaret's passing, Ethan found himself back in Central Park. He sat on the bench where he and Margaret had spent so many afternoons, watching the world go by. As he sat there, lost in memories, a voice broke through his reverie. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Ethan looked up to see a young woman, probably in her early 30s, smiling down at him. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, remembering Margaret's words about keeping his heart open, he smiled back. "Not at all," he replied, gesturing for her to sit. As they fell into easy conversation, Ethan felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't the all-consuming passion he had shared with Margaret, but rather a gentle reminder that life, with all its potential for joy and connection, continued on. Later that evening, Ethan stood in front of Margaret's grave, a bouquet of her favorite flowers in his hand. He traced the letters of her name on the headstone, a sad smile playing on his lips. "I met someone today," he said softly. "I think you would have liked her. She reminds me a bit of you, that same spark in her eyes." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm trying, Margaret, trying to live the way you taught me. It's not easy, but I promise you, I'm not giving up." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. Margaret was gone, but the love they had shared, the lessons she had taught him, would live on forever. He placed the flowers gently at the base of the headstone, his fingers lingering for a moment on the cool marble. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." As Ethan walked away, his steps lighter than they had been in months, he could almost hear Margaret's voice on the breeze, urging him forward. Love, he realized, didn't end with death. It transformed, becoming a guiding light, a gentle push towards a future full of possibilities. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be moments of doubt, of longing, of grief. But Ethan knew now that he had the strength to face them. Margaret had given him that gift, the courage to live fully, to love deeply, and to embrace every moment of the precious gift that is life. As he left the cemetery, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would honor Margaret's memory not through endless mourning, but by living the life she had shown him was possible. A life filled with love, adventure, and the unwavering belief that every day, every moment, was a gift to be cherished. And so, with hope in his heart and Margaret's love as his guiding star, Ethan stepped forward into the future, ready to write the next chapter of his life. A chapter infused with the wisdom, love, and zest for life that Margaret had instilled in him. In the end, their love story hadn't been about defying age or cheating death. It had been about two souls connecting, teaching each other valuable lessons about life, love, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. And in that sense, their story would never truly end. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.